So, François Bourguinon, Director of the Paris School of Economics.
Thank you. We're very happy to have you. My first question is, in light of the recent financial crisis, do you think that we need to change the way we measure progress, and if so, how?
Yes. Two possible answers to that question. One is, why was it the case that our measures didn't tell us anything about the coming crisis? If we had a good measure of progress, of well-being, we would have taken into account the fact that at some stage there was a bubble on the housing prices in many countries, and that this was not sustainable. So somehow the non-sustainability of the situation should have appeared in the measures that we are using. It didn't. So from that point of view, certainly there is something more to be done. And the second thing is, looking at GDP per capita is not the only thing that we should be looking at. It is possible for GDP per capita to go up, and yet to have the poorest part of the population to be worse off, simply because most of the gain is going to the top of the distribution. As a matter of fact, is exactly what happened in the United States before the crisis. Now, with the crisis, it is also extremely important to know who is paying for the crisis. Is it more the poor people, more the richest people? This means that aggregate measures of the type that we are using and that are reported in the media are not enough to really evaluate the true progress or the lack of progress made by our societies.
So in keeping with that, beyond GDP, what do you think a multidimensional kind of poverty measure adds to the analysis?
One thing which is important is that in our societies, and not only in our developed and rich post-industrial societies, but also in traditional societies, you cannot buy everything with money. There are many things which you cannot buy and which you cannot dispose of. For example, you are in an environment and the environment is deteriorating. You have less water, the water is polluted, the air is polluted. There is nothing you can do. Or maybe you can simply migrate to another country in the world, but it is a very big decision. Now, as long as there are things which enter your welfare and that you cannot buy, it is clear that income, monetary income, cannot be the only indicator of well-being. We have to take into account those components of well-being that cannot be bought on the market and which must be considered side by side with income. You cannot buy, you can buy health care, but if you are born with bad genes, you cannot buy them. In the same way, you cannot buy clean air when the air is completely polluted. So, because of that, we have to take into account those non-income or non-economic or non-monetary dimensions of well-being.
Do you see the future of economics and poverty measures kind of heading in that direction, or where do you think the future of kind of measurements of well-being will be?
I think so. I will tell you something, an experience that we have gone through in France, but also in other developed countries, maybe more in continental Europe. As I believe in the UK, we introduced several years ago minimum income guarantees, so that nobody in the society can fall below some income threshold, whatever the situation. Whether the person has a job, no job, doesn't matter. There is a threshold below which it is impossible to fall. Now we thought that because of that we had, to some extent, or partly solved the problem of poverty, and that people would be not happy, but would have less hardship because of that. Now, what we're discovering today is that this is not enough. That people who are able to take advantage of those income guarantees, at the same time feel socially excluded. Why? Because they don't have a job. They cannot work like everybody else. So when they talk to their neighbors, their friends, their family, they feel that they don't belong to society. Now, this social exclusion is something very important for social life. And this means that income per se is simply not enough. And from now on, I would say that it will be completely impossible to disregard these other non-income dimensions.
Okay. And I'd like to ask, what do you see are the benefits of the Multidimensional Poverty Index that OPHI has developed for the United Nations Human Development Report that we kind of discussed earlier?
The interest is that I would say that the interest is really for developing countries, and I would see two dimensions in this progress. One is the fact that in developing countries, income measurement, consumption measurement is not very good. You go to the countryside in Niger, in Mozambique, or in Laos, and you try to give a value to the rice or the sorghum that people are eating. So you go to the next village and you say, okay, what is the price of a kilo of sorghum? And then you impute a value to what they consume. This is extremely imprecise, which means that monetary measures of poverty in those countries are very imprecise. And from that point of view, measuring, as OPHI does, deprivation, asking people whether they have water, access to drinkable water, whether what is the kind of floor their house is equipped with, whether their kids go to school or not, whether they have access to health care, etc. This is a direct measure of what people can do. And in the vocabulary that is being used in OPHI, this is what are called the capabilities of the people following Amartya Sen. And from that point of view, this is giving another dimension of poverty, which is this other dimension we were talking about a little earlier.
And how do you see that the MPI that OPHI developed could grow in the future?
It might become more and more used by governments in developing countries if they are successful. People will say, on the one hand, we have monetary poverty, which is measuring something, but this is not enough. So we have to complement this with the kind of multidimensional poverty indicators that OPHI is developing. And if they are able to convince policymakers in developing countries to do that, this will be a great success.
Okay, and just lastly, how do you think that individual countries can sort of adapt and improve, or for their local country, the MPI that OPHI's developed for the UN Human Development Report?
With the OPHI index, I mean the MPI, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, developed by OPHI, policymakers will have the possibility of understanding identifying the dimension in well-being that is responsible for the lack of progress of the Multidimensional Poverty Index. For example, they will be able to identify education as being the problem, health being the problem, housing being the problem, access to health care being the problem. Then this is extremely important because this means that they will know what the priority should be in their policies, in their infrastructure investment policies in the future in order to reduce poverty as fast as possible.